Good evening. I'm Don Owen. I'm the Deputy Village Manager for Glenview. I'd like to welcome everyone tonight and thank you for coming out, spending some of your time with us. I would like to let you know that we are videotaping this presentation tonight just for those that couldn't attend, so that they'll have an opportunity to get some of the same information that we're going to display to you for you tonight. And again, I just wanted to remind you of the purpose tonight. We've asked for the Federal Aviation Administration and the Chicago Department of Aviation to come to Glenview and help us understand some of the physical changes and the operational changes at O'Hare International Airport. Obviously, we all know it's a great asset to our region, yet it does come with some impacts. And so we've had several residents reach out to the Village of Glenview and ask us to help, first of all, explain what's changing, what's happening. And then obviously our role from the Village of Glenview is that we want to represent you and hopefully help, if you have concerns, to help mitigate those. So I've been spending quite a bit of time on the project and learning more about it, and Michelle House to my right is also one of our staff members. So we're going to be continually available to you if you have questions after the meeting tonight, to have a dialogue, to try to help you get information. There is a wealth of information available about the changes, but we thought it would be helpful if we could invite both the FAA and CDA here tonight and give you a little bit of an overview. It helps me sometimes to have visuals, sometimes to have the experts to help explain a couple of the questions. And then once we get through the presentation, we will have an opportunity for question and answers. So we look forward to giving you that opportunity as we get into the presentation. So again, to my left, thank you again for Christina Drouet and Aaron Frame for coming. Christina's with the FAA and Aaron's from the Chicago Department of Aviation. And we're going to ask them to talk about their agencies, some of the roles and responsibilities. There's been quite a bit of change at O'Hare. Some of you may know that, some of you may not. But there's an O'Hare modernization program that's been ongoing. Very interesting to see what is a drastic change in how the airport is operated. And then there's also some additional investments that you've probably read about in the multi-billion-dollar range of investments for also improving the terminals. So there'll be a little bit about what's called O'Hare 21, so you can see information on that. And then after the meeting, like I said, Michelle and I are available, through the next couple of weeks if you have questions and answers. We attend a variety of meetings on a monthly basis that are held and made available for us for the different programs. So we're staying interactive on your behalf. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Christina Drouet from the Federal Aviation Administration. Christina.
Thank you, Don. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting us to come and speak to your community. Aaron and I have been doing this together for quite a while, and welcome the opportunity to help people understand what is going on at O'Hare and how a complex airport such as O'Hare is managed. And I'm going to start out talking about three different organizations that I think would be of benefit for any community around a big airport to know about. I'll start with the Federal Aviation Administration. We're part of the U.S. Department of Transportation. And our primary mission is to ensure safety for the flying public, for the rest of us on the ground that aren't flying. And we do that through a number of different ways. We provide safety oversight and regulatory oversight for the airlines, for pilots, for the operators, mechanics, anyone involved in the safe flight of aircraft. We set standards and we inspect airports to ensure that they meet our standards for geometry, for safety response, for many different things. So we have a large regulatory safety role primarily. Everyone knows about us, I think, only because you know of air traffic. Air traffic controllers work for the Federal Aviation Administration as well. And between our safety workforce, our air traffic controllers, we ensure the safety and efficiency of the nation's navigable airspace. We don't have the authority to prohibit aircraft flight. That comes into question a lot from a lot of times general aviation operations. The airspace is there for all to use. We regulate so that it's used safely. When we have a busy airport such as O'Hare or Midway, we do make those decisions on how to handle the high traffic demand, how runways are used. We design the airspace that's used to get in and out of a large complex airport like O'Hare, and actually the airspace across the entire country, how to get from point A to point B. That airspace is designed by the FAA, much like a village engineer might design the roads to get through or in around Glenview, we design the airspace so that it's used safely and efficiently. We provide grant funds for airports as well, for the O'Hare modernization, which we'll spend some time talking about. The FAA has funded over $1 billion in federal aid to ensure that the project moves forward because O'Hare is such an important asset to the national airspace system. If O'Hare isn't working efficiently, the entire national airspace system suffers across the country. So that's a very broad overview of what FAA does. I don't know if I should speak for CDA or let Aaron speak for CDA. Okay, all right, I've been delegated to. Chicago Department of Aviation very simply owns and operates both O'Hare and Midway. They have a major role in terms of the safe operation of those airports, and as I mentioned, from a regulatory perspective, the FAA is involved in safe operation of those airports. They receive the grant money that the FAA issues, and they have to use that towards projects that meet safety standards, design standards, and a large part of what we'll be talking about today is how it's used for sound insulation and sound mitigation. So, not to speak for CDA, but CDA is among one of many airport operators around the country that takes its responsibility to the communities around it seriously and wants to make sure that the funding that goes towards sound insulation and other mitigation projects and programs is appropriately used. You can see in the list of bullets there's the residential sound insulation department office that Aaron manages, school sound insulation, noise monitors, we'll talk about all those things. CDA also has a noise complaint portal, both a hotline and a website. CDA operates the airport, so they've got to keep the runways clean, get the snow off of there in the winter, get the puddles off of there in the summer, make sure that there aren't any potholes or any other problems with the pavements, and those are all the kinds of things that fall onto the shoulders of the city of Chicago. And here around O'Hare and around Midway, but speaking for around O'Hare, a lot of communities, you're very fortunate that you have this organization called the O'Hare Noise Compatibility Commission. It has been around for around 20 years. It includes 43 communities, such as yours, and 22 school districts. Many years ago, the primary role that ONCC played was to help prioritize that sound insulation money. What schools are the most important schools to sound insulate first? And they've branched out and they've expanded what they get deeply involved with since then. As you can see, there are other subcommittees as well as school sound insulation technical committee, recently established Fly Quiet committee, and I can understand why this community would be very interested in understanding the Fly Quiet committee. And you are a member, your community is a member of the ONCC, and you have a representative that goes to the meetings and represents the interests of your community there. And then you can see the list of roles and responsibilities for the ONCC. And I think it's Aaron's turn now, so.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Aaron Frame. I work for the Chicago Department of Aviation. So Christina and I are going to take turns on slides tonight. There are some slides that are a little bit more air traffic focused, and Christina will talk about those, and I'll talk about a little bit more on the airport side. So the slide that you have in front of you, we have three sets of statistics from left to right. So in the left-hand column, we talk about total passengers. Airports have a number of ways that we benchmark each other. So it's important for all of you to know that Chicago is the 6th busiest airport in the world in terms of passengers. The top 5 that you can see are Atlanta, Beijing, Dubai, Tokyo, and Los Angeles. So in terms of the United States, we are number 3. In the middle column, we are looking at cargo. And cargo is measured in metric tons, so we're looking at the weight of the cargo. Chicago is not a large cargo hub, but we do have cargo facilities, and we are very interested to see that number grow. You can see that we've added a box at the bottom. We are actually 20th in the world for cargo tonnage, and as I said, that's been on the rise in the last couple of years. In the right-hand column, that column is labeled aircraft movements. Movement is an industry term that essentially means an operation or what we call an arrival or a departure. So we count arrivals and departures, we add those two together to get total movements. And what you can see is that we are second in the world for the total number of flights. Last year in 2017, we had 867,049 takeoffs and landings at O'Hare, and the only airport in the world that had more was Atlanta. Now, one of the interesting things about that is O'Hare by itself comes in second, but if we were to add O'Hare and Midway, representing the city and the metropolitan area, definitely the sum of Chicago, O'Hare, and Midway would be well above Atlanta. So what you see here are several airports, Los Angeles included. They've got a couple of reliever airports where the largest airport is ranked, but what you're not seeing is the total number of flights within the metropolitan area. So again, these are three different ways that we measure statistics for all of the airports for comparison purposes. Okay, so this is a line graph showing that same total for 2017. I said it was 867,000. So what we've done is taken that yearly statistic and breaking it down into the monthly numbers. And this is important for all of you simply to see that during the summer months where we are now, air traffic at O'Hare is generally on the rise. That tends to be a combination of regular business travelers as well as families traveling on holiday or vacation. You'll see a dip down in the winter, and this is very consistent from year over year. In 2017, you can see on the left-hand side, February was the lowest month for the number of flights, and August is what we call the peak month. On the right-hand side of that page, you'll see the total number of flights. We have divided those into further categories. So 97% of the flights that are flying at O'Hare are what we call dedicated passenger. 2% are dedicated cargo. The reason why we use that terminology, dedicated cargo, is that many commercial airplanes that you would be flying on do carry cargo in the belly of the aircraft. So an example would be any airline such as United or American that has a contract with the U.S. Postal Service to carry mail. If that U.S. mail is in the belly of the aircraft, that's considered cargo. So what we're doing here on the slide is trying to distinguish for all of you that a dedicated passenger is essentially focused on passenger traffic, and dedicated cargo is exclusively cargo. So that's 2% of the total, and then 1% is what we call general aviation. Those are the smaller planes that are essentially turboprops and or charter flights.
Okay, so earlier I mentioned the fact that over $1 billion in federal grant money was invested by the U.S. government in the O'Hare modernization. And when federal money is involved in any kind of a public improvement project, there are certain environmental laws and policies that, pardon me, need to be followed. And so this slide talks about the National Environmental Policy Act. This is the law that requires any kind of a project with federal investment be analyzed from an environmental perspective. What are the impacts? Is there noise? Is there air pollution? Is there an impact to wetlands? Is there an impact to wildlife? There are 26 resource categories that get analyzed whenever a project gets studied from the perspective of NEPA. And so not to rehash a lot of history, but in the early 2000s, when the city of Chicago put forth its plan for the O'Hare modernization, the FAA went through a comprehensive environmental analysis of that plan, following the law as set out by NEPA, and came to the conclusion that this project had benefits moving forward. NEPA, along with our FAA orders and policies, guide us and govern how we evaluate a project for feasibility, for appropriateness, and how it is best implemented. And in going through an evaluation from a NEPA perspective, we always look at the no-action alternative and what are the environmental consequences of that. So for a project like O'Hare, where demand was steadily increasing and the geometry of the airport made it very complex to handle a high volume of traffic, As we get to talking about the O'Hare modernization and the runway layout, you'll see that it provided actual environmental benefits to untangle the runways at O'Hare and provide a more efficient airfield and in turn, a safer operation for O'Hare. So in reviewing the O'Hare modernization as part of our requirements under NEPA, we issued a record of decision at the end of September in 2005, giving the environmental approval for the O'Hare modernization. A big part of NEPA is also to provide mitigation. As an example, as part of the expansion, there were several acres of wetlands that were impacted by the project. The city of Chicago then bought compensatory wetlands, I think in the far southern suburbs. Yes. And so it was, yes, there's an impact here, however, we will compensate for it somewhere else. Similarly, yes, the airport is going to, the airplanes using the airport are going to generate noise. How do we mitigate for noise? And there are federal rules that talk about noise levels, acceptable noise levels, and at what level do you provide sound insulation to mitigate the noise that's generated by an airport development. And so all of that was addressed in our environmental document, and we'll provide information at the end where you can see all these documents and review them. The city has provided sound insulation for approximately 6,000 homes falling within a certain area of the airport based on how intense the noise is. And once the build-out, once all the runway work is finished at O'Hare at the end of 2021, the city again will look at noise impacts and see if everything that was if anything additional needs to be insulated from what was insulated. All of that kind of analysis was covered in our environmental analysis. Oops. Uh-oh, went too far. This is mine, right? So this is what O'Hare looked like prior to the O'Hare modernization starting. You can see on the north half of the airfield, the top half of the diagram, several intersecting runways. Just as road intersections can be dangerous, runway intersections are not the safest way to operate an airfield either. We have many other safety considerations to take into account. And if you look at airports that have been built more recently, such as Denver, you'll see that it's all parallel runways. Over time, we've learned that's the better way to build an airport. Over time, aircraft technology has allowed more performance under different kinds of wind and weather conditions, and a parallel airfield based on prevailing winds is really what makes the most sense now in terms of safe and efficient operations for a major airport.
So just to add to what Christina said before we get into this video, I'm going to go back one slide. Sure. Sorry about that. Before we get into this future airfield, let me go back one slide and just add to what Christina was saying. If I can, yeah. So that triangle shaded in green that you see on the north side of O'Hare, that was really a product of growth over the decades. As many of you know, O'Hare started out as Orchard Place or Orchard Field. Those runways were essentially assigned to the Douglas Manufacturing Company and the military that took over after World War II. And those runways were very much a part of the land that either the Douglas folks or the city owned at that time. Over the decades, we have acquired a bit more land and redeveloped the land that we do have in order to make future runway build-out possible. So on this next slide, I'm going to let the video play for you. So what you're going to see are runways come up out of the flat screen, so to speak, and we're going to tilt the airfield so that you can see when we started this development program, we had 7 runways to begin, and when we're finished the O'Hare modernization program, we'll have 8 runways. Let's see if we can get this to go. Not cooperating. Let me just back up a little bit. Okay, there we go. So what's happening is the yellow runways are going to move. So we're adding an extension and a runway on the north. And then what we're doing is essentially turning a lot of those intersecting runways into parallel runways. And you can see on the south side of the airport, the bottom right of the screen, that yellow runway is on top of existing buildings, and that's one of the places where we did do some land acquisition in a neighboring community. Let me see if I can get this to replay one more time. We've shown this video over the last decade or so, and we thought it would be helpful for all of you just to visualize it. It does get a little confusing when we talk about the different runway names and which runways are the left runways and the right runways and the center runways. And so in the middle of the screen, you can see the terminal complex. So that gives you a visual illustration of what it is that we're trying to accomplish with the airfield improvements. So one of the guiding principles of that airfield layout is that modern hub airports rely on parallel runway layouts for safe and efficient operations. That's what Christina said. A number of the newer airports within the country and around the world, the two most recent new airfields would be Denver and Atlanta before that. Both of those airports are built on parallel runway systems. So what you see on the right-hand side, the red runways are going away. The one on the right side, that red runway went away in 2016, and then the one on the left, we just decommissioned that about 3 months ago. We will keep one of the black runways you can see is intersecting, so we'll have a couple of parallels. And the reason for that is there are certain times of the year where weather conditions necessitate when we have weather patterns with strong winds from the northeast that we would use those two black runways that are parallel. But as I said, the red runways, those are runways 14 left, 32 right, or 14 right, 32 left. They provided limited utility in the full parallel runway system. And essentially that's if an airplane is on one of those runways, then the air traffic controllers would delay the departure or the arrival on the other one, or the term that we use is called hold short. So over time, the FAA has steadily increased the safety at airports all around the country, and including in the airspace. So what you see are a few of the bullets of progressive improvements in how we manage safety for the airfield system. In the spring of 2014, about 4 years ago, we had a new rule that talked about converging runways. What you're seeing on the screen is where runways literally intersect, so we call those intersecting runways. But then you have other runways where one runway is pointing toward the end of another, and if you were to extend those runway center lines, they would eventually intersect. So what we use for terminology is we call that a converging runway. So in April 2014, the FAA issued a rule that converging runways were to be avoided. The next one down, runway safety areas. At the end of each runway and around the perimeter, there is essentially a clear zone that tells the airport operator not to put buildings or other structures in that area. And so in improving runway safety areas and removing obstacles that may be in the way, that was another rulemaking, and we had a deadline of December 2015. And then finally, there was an initiative in 2016 that was called irregular geometry. As many of you know, when you're driving down the street, if you've got a four-way stop, that provides increased visibility. The same is true on the airfield. So when we do have runways or taxiways that have an angled approach, we are much more particular about how that intersection is utilized on the ground. And so this FAA initiative about irregular geometry was to reduce the potential for any what are called runway incursions. And that's where there's a potential for an accident or an actual concern with an aircraft being in a section of the airport where it is not supposed to be. Okay. So the OMP over time has resulted in fewer flight delays. So on the left-hand side, when we look at the pre-OMP numbers, you're seeing what's called a poor weather arrival throughput rate. So one of the ways we measure the airfield performance is to look at an hourly number. And so in east flow, you see that number in parentheses, or the descriptor is east-west. In east flow, we could do as many as 56 flights an hour, and in west flow, 72. But we have greatly improved that over the past 10 to 13 years. In today's airfield, the arrival rate is either a 92 in east flow or a 106 in west flow. That's very advantageous. One of the primary goals of the OMP was to reduce airspace delays. And by reorienting the airfield and essentially redoing the pavement and the geometry, those improvements on the ground are leading to improvements in the air. So in the bottom left, the system impact delays have been reduced by 63% when comparing the 6 years prior to the OMP to the entire period since the OMP began. So this is a little bit of statistics, but generally what we're trying to illustrate is, again, these ground improvements are improving the airspace as well, and that was a primary goal. On the right-hand side of the page, we have a couple of line charts. The orange chart at the top, the orange line rather, the scale is on the right-hand side. What you're seeing are annual aircraft operations. Those are essentially the same as the line chart that I had showed you earlier for 2017, but instead of showing the monthly, we're showing a period of 17 years over time. Many people are surprised to know the orange line and the blue line both peak in 2004. That was the busiest year for flights at O'Hare. So after the events of 9/11, there was a natural dip in terms of air traffic across the country. But at O'Hare, it actually rebounded after a number of months, and then it continued to increase until 2004. Then we saw a gradual dip in the in the aircraft operations. And then once the recession hit in about 2008, you see that orange line is bottoming out in about the year 2009, rebounded within a year or two, and essentially between 2010 and 2017, the number of flights at O'Hare has essentially been the same. If we take that scale and stretch it out, you'll see it's plus or minus 20 or 30,000 flights. But essentially for the last 8 or 9 years, the number of flights at O'Hare has been the same. So that's the orange line with the scale on the right. The line below that, those are delays in terms of operations, or again, the number of flights. So the red text boxes are illustrating a bit what's going on with the blue line. So you see in the bottom left of that graph in 2000, 2001, 2002, we have what's called a high density rule phase out. That means that airports around the country that had a lot of flights were limited. In other words, that was the tool that the FAA was using to manage the flights at that time. Then again, in 2004, we see a sharp incline in delays, and that was one of the primary reasons why the OMP was needed. In 2005, 2006, the FAA had instituted flight caps. So you see a sharp reduction in about 2005 as a result of those flight caps. That went on until about 2008, and we opened the first new runway since 1971. It had been 37 years since O'Hare had a new runway come online. Runway 9 left, 27 right is the runway on the very northernmost part of the airport property. Again, as with 2004 and the flight caps, by building that additional pavement, that freed up traffic on the ground and traffic in the air, and so the delays sharply declined in 2009. And then we've had a little bit of back and forth over the last 8 years. In 2012, 2013, 2014, you do see that converging runway operations rule. We did manage that a bit. In 2013, we had a new runway come online called runway 10 center, 28 center. And then we had our third new runway, 10 right, 28 left, come online in 2015. As a result of all of those changes, the delays now in 2017 are at a decades low point, which is positive. That shows that the improvements that we're making are making a positive difference. Okay. The three graphics, excuse me, that you see are comparing the airfield in 2005, 2018, and where we're going in 2021. The goal of this slide is to show you where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. So in 2005, on the left-hand side, you do see 3 sets of dual parallel runways. And I want to mention that because many times at our public meetings, we do have Noise Commission members as well as members of the public that do talk about parallel runways. And I think it's important to distinguish which parallels, are being referenced. We had some parallels that pointed to the northwest. We've got some parallels that point to the northeast. And then, of course, we've got parallels going east-west. So 2005, 3 sets of parallels and a north-south runway, and we had dual independent arrivals in poor weather conditions. By 2018, 13 years later, this year, you can see all of the improvements are done in blue. And 2 of those diagonal runways or parallel runways pointing to the northwest are now decommissioned and gone. So in 2018, we have 5 parallel east-west runways and triple independent arrivals in all weather conditions. So that last bullet, what that means is triple independent arrivals. Oftentimes during our busiest hours at O'Hare, we are utilizing 3 runways to handle aircraft arrivals. And so what that means is independent arrivals, all of the runways that are utilized for arrivals can operate independently of each other. There are no dependencies, meaning there are no intersections and no convergences that we need to keep in mind. And the most positive part about that is that it works in all weather conditions. We do take some slowdowns when the weather is inclement, but the airfield was designed to handle that. And finally, on the right-hand side, what you're seeing is in 2021, we have 1 green runway, which opens in the fall of 2020, and then we've got a runway extension to an existing runway, and that's supposed to open at the end of 2021. So when the OMP is done, we will have 6 parallel east-west runways and maintain that triple independent arrivals in all weather conditions. That's the what's called the build-out, or when the entire airfield is built out. We often talk about the build-out condition, and the graphic that you see in 2021 represents that build-out condition.
All right. I want to talk a little bit about how the airport gets used now that you've seen how the runways are laid out, how they get used. And Aaron started talking about this before. Triple parallel independent approaches, so that means there's enough space between the runways and enough visibility for the air traffic controllers and separation between the flights so that they can safely land 3 at a time on those 3 runways where you see the red arrows. That's how for these graphics, that's how we're showing the arrivals. The red arrows are the incoming aircraft. And then at the same time, you'll see that there are 2 runways that are being used for departures, the green arrows, the aircraft leaving the airport. In analyzing the O'Hare modernization, of course, we looked at weather, we looked at what orientation makes sense for the runways and how would they be used. And in looking at the way the weather varies over the year in an area like Chicago, we came up with this concept for how to manage air traffic. And based on the prevailing winds, roughly annualized over the course of an entire year, 70% of the time, O'Hare is going to be operating in west flow, the diagram on the left, and 30% of the time, roughly, in east flow. Again, this is annualized over the course of the year. Any one day, you might look out and see one or the other. In general, this time of year, spring going into early summer, we've been in east flow a lot over the last handful of months. Certainly in the fall and the winter, you're going to see a lot more west flow. Well, what does all of that mean? What does that mean to Glenview? Push the right button here. This is a diagram, and you can see Glenview on the map up here. When we're operating in east flow, and this is a picture of actual operations from March of this year, The red lines, as shown on the previous drawing, are the arrivals. You'll see that they are coming from wherever they're coming from. They line up to the west of the airport, make a 180, and head down, lined up with the runways to land on the runways, heading towards the lake in an easterly direction. And then we're using the two runways that you saw on the previous slide for departures. So these two runways are being used for departures. I can't get the mouse over there. Here. And so, wrong way. Okay, good thing I'm not an air traffic controller. Okay, so you can see, this is the one thing that it took a while, it takes a while to comprehend. You're leaving O'Hare, you want to go to Seattle. Seattle's west of here. Why in the world is my plane taking off over Lake Michigan? That's the opposite direction of where I need to go. Well, it's all because of the prevailing winds. Aircraft operate best and most safely when they're operating into the winds. And so if the winds are coming off the lake, you want to be taking off towards the lake. And then after you leave the runway, the air traffic controller gives the pilot a heading, a direction to turn in. And that's how you see, just looking at this diagram, you can imagine some of these planes are heading up to Minneapolis. They're heading out to Seattle. Maybe they're going to the west coast of Canada. It's pretty easy to see. The ones going straight north, they're probably heading over to Europe. The ones going to the northeast, they're going to Boston. They're going to New York. And similarly on the south departures, you can imagine, they're heading to Texas or Florida, Georgia, wherever. It's really pretty straightforward. Airspace is real complex, but once you see these radar tracks on a piece of paper, it makes sense in terms of how the traffic is managed. So that's east flow, and that's about 30% of the year, and typically in the spring into early summer. This is a picture of west flow, which happens about 70% of the year. You can see that the aircraft, regardless of where they came from, they're coming somewhere over to the west of O'Hare. They're going to head east over Lake Michigan, do a U-turn over Lake Michigan, and land on those three runways pointing in a westerly direction. And so similarly, the departures, it makes sense in west flow. I'm heading to Seattle. I'm going to get pretty straight heading out of the airport. But hey, I really am going to Boston. I need to make that hard right turn. And you'll see those flights over your community as well. So that's why you see aircraft heading in different directions at different times of day. Where are they going? Why are they where they're at? It's all part of how air traffic control manages the volume at O'Hare, manages it safely, and uses the runways that are available. And given the wind and weather conditions here in the Chicago area, this orientation of east-west runways makes the most sense to get a very efficient throughput at O'Hare. Sure.
I'd like to add one other piece of data that I've talked with several of you about as well. What are the altitudes of some of the aircraft as they fly over Glenview? And this chart, I think, shows some of the altitudes when you look at the colors of the lines. So, for example, if you're right at the airport, if it's black or very dark green colors, it says less than 2,000 feet MSL, which is mean sea level. Glenview is about, 630 feet above sea level. So you kind of have to take these numbers and subtract our altitude or our elevation above sea level. And so, so generally what you see is that obviously when planes are taking off, they're going to be climbing 100 feet, 200 feet, 300 feet as they get higher. And as they turn out, I'm talking about the left-hand side green just for starters. They're climbing out. You can see then it goes to a darker green. It goes from a dark green to a little bit lighter shade of green, and that's 2,000 to 4,000 feet MSL, mean sea level. And then as it gets over Glenview, it's 4,000 to 6,000 feet MSL. And so what I've told a lot of people is that by the time those departures come over Glenview, they're about 5,000 feet above the ground-ish, plus or minus. So I think that's also interesting to know when it comes to, later I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about the sound attenuation efforts. By the time planes get to Glenview, yes, some fly over Glenview, but they're at quite a high altitude. I think that's a question people have. And then the other thing is you probably see that the two parallel diagonal runways that remain, Obviously most of the runways are now east-west orientation, but the two diagonal runways that remain, that one right now that Christina was pointing at, the northerly one of those two comes to Glenview. So we will then have, just looking at this general altitude, you're going to notice that there'll be flights coming into and landing on that diagonal runway, and those are about 1,500 feet above Glenview. So I think those are just a couple quick pieces of information that are interesting to know, and I noticed the different colors on here that would be just helpful to you to point those out. Thank you.
We have three pages right in a row where we've labeled all the runways, and we've got these green arrows for departures and the red arrows for arrivals. And then within inside each of those arrows, we have two numbers. There's a white number representing a percentage of use during daytime hours throughout the year, and then the black number is representing nighttime percentage throughout the year. So we have all three of these in here. Right now, I wanted to show you this 2015, which is fairly accurate to where we are. But as we talked about, where my mouse is right now, this runway, this diagonal, has been just decommissioned 3 months ago. So any use that would have been on this runway is now likely down here for departures or down here for departures. And similarly, any arrivals are going on the runways on either side of it. So this is important because it gives an indication of individual runway use throughout the year. So when we are landing in west flow, these are the west flow arrivals, you can see where the mouse is, about 25% are landing on that runway 27 left. And then as we go to the south airfield, runway 28 center is getting about 22, 23%. And then on the north runway, we've got about 20%. So those three runways are receiving the lion's share of the arrivals when we're in west flow. Those numbers are flipped when we're in east flow. And then on the left-hand side, we've got departures. And these are very consistent, and they correlate to the flight tracks that Christina was explaining on the prior slides. So 2015 gives you sort of a snapshot. We do have all, if you're interested, I can send these through the Glenview staff. We have all of these individual pages because I know that on your printouts tonight, we put a couple of slides per page. So we certainly can give these to you in a larger format. So this is 2015. This is very similar to what we're experiencing today. The next graphic is 2020. So you can see both of the yellow runways are the runways that have been decommissioned. And this is important because that next runway that we're opening is on the north airfield where my mouse is right now. That's 9 center, 27 center. So that will be utilized in east flow. I think this is about 13% for east flow departures during the day. But moreover, on the right-hand side, you can see the arrivals. 27 center, when you're arriving this direction, will get about 19% of the daytime flights. So that's good in that it's balancing out the north airfield and the south airfield. So that's sort of what's to come in about 2.5 years, meaning that the runway utilization today that we have will change once another runway is included into the mix. And then the last graphic of this similar format is what we call build out. And again, that's when all the runways are done and including where my mouse is, a runway extension that we had shown highlighted on a prior slide. So this is what is envisioned at the completion of OMP. Now, one of the things I wanted to show you, right where my mouse is, this runway 4 left, that's pointing to the northeast, for departures, I think this number is 0.8. It's either a 0.6 or a 0.8 during the daytime. That's very seldom used during daytime hours, 1.2% during nighttime hours. And some of that has to do with what we call shoulder hours, hours that are just on the cusp of daytime, nighttime, or at the reversed nighttime, daytime. In the arrivals direction, you can see 0.3% of the arrivals during daytime hours and 0.3% nighttime hours. So all of that is intended to let you know that this runway should see even less usage than it does even today. So this graphic is showing the extent of a certain level of noise, and I'll replay this a couple of times. So here is Glenview in the upper right-hand side of the screen. So when we measure noise, we're looking at certain decibel levels, and think of these noise contours a lot like ripples in a pond. If you throw a rock in a pond, the ripples radiate outward. And so this is a certain level of noise equal to 65 decibels when averaged over the entire year. When we do noise modeling in the computer, the FAA has determined that all of the nighttime flights are extremely bothersome to homeowners such as yourselves, and every nighttime flight that's calculated actually has a 10 decibel penalty. And another way of saying that is that one nighttime flight has the same value as 10 daytime flights. And again, that's because many people are at home at night, and those nighttime flights are extremely bothersome. So let me run this for you again. So the first, I would call it major noise contour that we did was in 1979. Let's see if we can get this to run. There we go. And that went quite a ways into Niles and almost to Morton Grove. And you're seeing this lobe of the contour reduce in the northeast because it's getting less and less utilization. So the green is when we get into 1997. Here we are at 2000. And largely this is due to improvements in the jet engine technology. And then in 2002, and then it drastically changes shape for O&P build-out, and that's a direct result, not necessarily the aircraft engines, but because the runways themselves have been reoriented. And so the noise impacts are going in a much more east-west direction as opposed to all directions from the old airfield. Don, do you want me to go ahead and answer that question now? Sure, I can answer that. So there are two ways of looking at noise. So there's noise monitoring, where we put a monitoring device in the neighborhood, and it records noise 24 hours a day and downloads all the noise to our office. When we do that, those microphones are picking up all noise. So the way we can identify that it's with a flight is we're looking at the FAA radar data, and when we see a spike in the decibel levels at the noise monitor, what we do is take those two data sets and correlate them together. When we see a noise spike in decibels and we see a plane fly over that location, we can draw a conclusion that that noise spike can be attributed to an aircraft. So we, the city of Chicago, we have 33 noise monitors around O'Hare in all directions, and we do run the noise monitoring system. But when you have future noise, noise that has not yet happened, the technique that we use is noise modeling. And essentially we're running a computer model to predict what noise levels may occur in the future. Those noise models are complicated in that not only are we looking at how many planes may be arriving at O'Hare in that future year, but what kind of aircraft would they be? How many Boeings, how many Airbuses, and how many other aircraft that are perhaps a little older would be flying into O'Hare. So not only are we looking at the number of flights, we're looking at the type of aircraft, and we're also looking at in what combinations of runways would we use. One of the earlier slides that Christina was showing you was how we utilize the airfield in a west flow or an east flow. And it's those combinations of runways that really help move the air traffic in and out of the airport. And so that's another key parameter that's put into the computer to estimate future noise. So we look at, as Christina mentioned, the 70%, 30%, that is reflective of the majority of wind conditions throughout the year. So that's another variable that's put into the model to illustrate that. So let me talk just very quickly about Fly Quiet. I think many of you may have heard about this, and we thought maybe this warranted a mention. So Between the time period of, in 2015, we started looking at the possibility of rotating runways during the nighttime hours. As I mentioned, O'Hare is the second busiest airport in the world for the number of flights. So it is not practical to try to do a rotation program during the daytime hours. It is feasible to do it during nighttime hours. We are currently getting about 10% of all of the flights at O'Hare happen during the nighttime hours. And the federal government defines that as 10 at night until 7 o'clock in the morning. That's a 9-hour period of time. And as I said, about 10% of our flights happen during those 9 hours. So in 2016, we did a test program. We called that Test 1. And then in 2017, we did Test 2 and 3. And along the way, we had a number of public meetings with the O'Hare Noise Compatibility Commission to review those results, take feedback from the members, and come up with criteria in order to inform that rotation. So what you see on the screen is the latest version of rotation that the Noise Commission has approved. And this is what we call interim fly quiet. The goal is to utilize, you can see in the middle of the screen, parallel runways, meaning east and west on one week. And then on the next week, these runways are also parallel, but they're in a diagonal direction. And so they're labeled diagonal. And so the Noise Commission determined that a rotation pattern of east and west runways versus the diagonals was a good rotation pattern. And the goal of this was to reduce impacts to the highest impacted communities. There are some communities just directly east and west of O'Hare that do have significant impacts. Many of those homes have been sound insulated, but some of them have not. Another one was to provide predictability. As Christina said, the airfield is very weather dependent, and prevailing winds is one of the leading factors as to what runways are utilized on any one day. So to the extent that we could, we wanted to provide some predictability for the homeowners. We knew that if we were going to rotate, it wasn't necessarily going to be very effective if we were rotating on a daily basis. Rotating on a daily basis is essentially what all of you are experiencing today. We may be in west winds, and tomorrow we may be in east winds. So we talked about whether to rotate for a month or whether to rotate for a week, and the Noise Commission determined that weekly would be optimum. And so what you see in this rotation pattern are 8 individual weeks, and what we're doing is taking 6 different air traffic configurations. Those are essentially the directions of the arrows and the combinations of the runways. We've come up with an 8-week pattern of alternating the parallels, which are the blue banners, and then the teal colored other diagonals. So that's the third bullet, alternate east and west flow to the extent we can. I will say that in each of these weeks, you see a white box labeled primary. That is the go-to configuration for the week. So we lay this out for the air traffic controllers so that they understand what the plan is during the overnight hours. If the winds are not conducive, so in this very first box of week 1, you can see these arrows pointing to the right, which is indicative of east flow. If the winds are not easterly on those nights, they will immediately switch to the secondary and use that. And then later in the week, when the winds go back to the direction we want them to for rotation purposes, air traffic knows to go back to the primary as soon as they can within the week. The weeks always start on a Sunday, and then Sunday night they'll start the next week's configuration. The fourth bullet down here was to avoid community impact, consecutive community impacts. It was difficult to come up with a rotation pattern that essentially was moving around the burden. That was a key concept that the Noise Commission asked us to look at. So what we've tried to do, to the best of our ability, is use runway configurations where that air traffic is spread out. Now that being said, as I mentioned, you can see here the configuration for week 2 is the same as the configuration in week 4. But we were trying to go every other week to achieve that balance. And then, of course, the fifth bullet is to balance the runway use. Again, we've got 6 combinations in an 8-week pattern. that we want to implement. This was approved by the Noise Commission in December. The FAA has now commenced an environmental analysis to look at those environmental impacts. And Christina will tell you a little bit about that timeline.
Yeah, so back to what I talked about earlier, the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, with any change that has an impact to the community, to the environment, there needs to be an environmental review. And the nature, the degree of the impact determines the extent of the environmental review that's required. What is being proposed and considered is an interim period of time. So from whenever this gets approved, which will be in about a year, until the end of 2020, when CDA finishes construction of that last new runway, is when this proposed plan would be in effect. So it is an interim fly-quiet plan. There's also a lot of energy. I'm going to diverge just for a moment. The Fly Quiet Committee of the O'Hare Noise Compatibility Commission recently started a conversation about what is Fly Quiet going to look like after all the runway work is finished at O'Hare. So that's a thought. It hasn't gotten very far yet. They've had one meeting. Aaron and his colleagues are working very diligently to provide information so that the ONCC committee can make some good decisions, but that's several years down the road. And since that is being proposed as a long-term proposal for O'Hare operations, that would go through a much more, I'm not going to say, a much thorough, rigorous, longer, well, the easiest word to use is longer. It would be a much more, would undergo a lot more scrutiny and modeling and planning and outreach and everything else for some sort of a long-term, different Fly Quiet program. So what Aaron started talking about just now, what this slide is about, is this interim Fly Quiet period until the end of 2020. And so the plan every other week using the 422 runways, which are the runways that impact this community the most, possibly could be used every other week overnight to manage air traffic. And just a little bit about what Aaron said. The ONCC reviewed all of this, had a lot of public conversation, voted, and made a recommendation to the Chicago Department of Aviation. The Chicago Department of Aviation chose to embrace that recommendation from the ONCC, from the communities, and run with it. And that is what CDA has given to the FAA to analyze. So this isn't anything that Aaron and I invented in our offices on a quiet afternoon because we wanted to do something different. This is something that has been out there in front of the communities for a very long time with a lot of interesting and very passionate debate from all of the communities that are impacted by it. And the 3 tests we did were very interesting and challenging just from an FAA perspective, because air traffic never operated the airfield this way before. They were challenging for the Chicago Department of Aviation because CDA never operated the airfield this way before. It was challenging for the airlines because the airlines at one point in time could ask air traffic for whatever runway they wanted to land on rather than having that conversation with the air carriers, which ONCC and CDA did and FAA did, to say, can we be better neighbors to these communities? Can we plan a little bit? Certainly we're going to provide for safety first, and any kind of an emergency, we do what we need to do. But for the routine stuff, can we plan this? Can we communicate better with the communities? Can we be that better neighbor? And so what's happened is really an amazing collaboration that hasn't happened anywhere else in the country, that the communities are talking, the airport operator is listening and helping to facilitate that conversation, and the FAA is finding ways to listen and work with those suggestions and really stretch what we do. And so this has been an amazing thing to view. I fortunately have the view from time to time of things going on across the country. What's going on here is just is very unique effort by the community and by the airport operator, and I'm really pleased that the FAA can support it and make a lot of this work. So that was an aside. As far as the plan for the interim Fly Quiet, as Aaron mentioned, the ONCC through a lot of deliberation, came up with a plan that they felt was equitable to the communities around O'Hare. CDA took some time to put some data and information behind that and presented it to the FAA in February. Right now, we, the FAA, are in the process of doing that environmental analysis of what is being proposed. Part of all of that involves hiring certain contractors to do modeling that Aaron was talking about earlier. We're working towards a reevaluation of the O'Hare Modernization Environmental Impact Statement. And our goal right now is, by the end of this calendar year, to have public meetings. And so you'll have an opportunity to come to a public workshop. We had workshops in 2015. We had workshops in 2005, where we provide a lot of information for the public to come, ask questions, have a smaller one-on-one dialogue with technical experts, our air traffic controllers, our airspace designers, and understand what's going on. And then we have a public comment period, review those comments, respond to those comments, and then we review all of that and make a final decision in terms of there are environmental benefits, there are environmental consequences, they will be mitigated this way, this is how it'll play out, and provide the appropriate public benefit with the appropriate mitigation associated with it. So that's where the interim Fly Quiet is heading. Hopefully within the next year, there'll be a plan. It'll be in place for about a year and a half until Runway 9 Center commissions. And so,
Yep.
the rest is yours.
Please stand.
I need to go.
We have given this presentation to the Glenview staff, so that will be available. We brought handouts of the presentation. They're up on the front table tonight. The FAA is the lead on the interim flight quiet analysis that Christina was just describing, and so there'll be a lot more dialogue at our Noise Commission meetings and information available throughout the year. Okay, are you taking off?
Yeah, and I need to apologize. I need to catch a flight and head out to Detroit this evening for another meeting tomorrow. We are very.
I'll stay.
Aaron is staying. I really apologize. We are happy to take any questions from the community, and we've worked with Don and Michelle, and we've met with them several times. I know I've written letters to you and to the village president, and we want to help all the communities understand what's going on, and so this kind of opportunity is great. I apologize, but I do have to run, and we'll follow up.
Yeah.
We do have a couple more slides, but if you would just help me thank Christina for coming tonight with a round of applause. Thank you, Christina.
It's okay.
So if you wouldn't mind holding your questions just for a few more minutes, Aaron will finish up the few final slides, and then I'll provide a few of oversight conclusions, if you will, and then we'll open up to questions and answers. And then we have a podium here where if you would like to come up and make it easier for everyone to hear, you're welcome to come up there to the podium and have questions, and then we'll continue on with the meeting. So, Aaron?
The slide you have in front of you is a map showing the proximity of Glenview to O'Hare. Glenview is outlined in the orange color, and the blue line down near O'Hare is the boundary line for sound insulation. The blue line is labeled 65 dNL. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, there's a certain level of noise that qualifies a home for sound insulation. And so there are about 8 or 9 communities in the immediate vicinity of O'Hare where we are doing sound insulation. One of the important features of this map that we wanted to show you, this purple star right here is the building we're in. This is the Glenview Village Hall. We wanted to show you that altitude, or rather elevation. So that's 1948 feet above ground level, would be where planes would be flying in that vicinity. This dashed line, as you can see, it's connecting all the way down to the airfield right here. So this yellow point in space is called ridge. Many of the identifying points are given names by the FAA so that they are easy to use over the radio for the pilots and the air traffic controllers. So this point is called ridge. It is approximately 5 nautical miles from the edge of the runway. Inside the black box, you're seeing a number of 2,200 feet above mean sea level. And what we've done is done the math that Don was describing, where we subtract the local elevation to get how many feet is it above ground level. And you can see that number is about 1,535. What that means is when a plane is coming in for an arrival to O'Hare on that runway, those planes at that point, when they're on the north side of Glenview, the white point, right about here, they should be at about 2,500 feet if they are hitting that point. And then as they're descending through the village of, or over the village of Glenview, I should say, by the time they're at the south edge, they've descended about 1,000 feet. And so they should be about 1,500 feet above the ground level. And then they continue into O'Hare and make that descent down to the ground. We do show the pink runways, or the runways left to be built. This blue line, the sound insulation, does account for those future runways. That was a requirement of the FAA to look at that future condition. But we did want to provide this map for you. This is one of the two handouts that we have up on the front table in order to show you just altitudes over the village of Glenview. As Don mentioned earlier, when we were talking about the green lines and the red lines, this would be one of those red lines when the aircraft are coming in for an arrival. Okay, so this shows you just some basic noise levels that were measured here at the Village Hall. We actually brought one of our portable monitors and put it here at the Village Hall for a period of 2 weeks. From November through December of 2016. We did that during runway rotation test number 1. We looked at daily levels on the right-hand side. As I mentioned, when the microphones are recording, they're recording all noise events. When we can correlate a flyover from an aircraft, we can isolate that noise event to aircraft versus everything else goes into community. Noise is measured logarithmically. You do not take the two numbers and simply add them up and divide by 2. So there is the logarithmic scale and the factor of 10 to account for. So on this particular day, November 18th, the aircraft contribution was less than the community, and then the grand total was 58.6 DNL for the day. That was done for all of the days during the 2 weeks. I can see here on December 1st, we must have had a monitor malfunction, which is why there's a scratch in the data. When we take a look at that, you can see some days are in the 30s and some days are in the mid 40s. A couple days were in the 50s in terms of decibels, averaged over the course of a day. So during that 2 week period, the monitor, when it was here at the Village Hall, was about 48.6. The community, the background noise was about 55.3, and the total DNL was 56.1. And as I mentioned earlier, when we do that noise modeling, we do that when noise hasn't happened. That's for the future. And so there are a number of factors that go into that noise model. But when we come up with that blue line that I mentioned on the prior slide, this slide, when we talk about that sound insulation boundary, we are only considering the aircraft noise. And so that's why when we do a noise report or look at noise data, we're very much focused on the aircraft data and not the total. Let's see if I can get this to advance. Okay, these are some resources. We have a number of web links. These are primarily from the 3 organizations, from the FAA, from our website at the CDA, it's flychicago.com. We have a number of noise resources, and a few of these are links to the Noise Commission website. Just a quick overview of what is the terminal area plan. As many of you may have heard in the news recently, we have announced a new program to modernize some of the terminals at O'Hare. So I won't go through this whole slide. It may be easier just to show you the pictures. In the middle of the screen is the existing terminal core. The gray buildings are, this is Terminal 1. Terminal 2 is right here where my mouse is. This is Terminal 3, where American is. And then over here is Terminal 5. The terminal area plan is a multi-year plan, multi-billion-dollar program. So just quickly, I'm going to walk you through the principal elements that we expect to see within the next 10 years. We do intend to, this is Concourse C. We do intend to add on to Concourse C and build a new Satellite 1 concourse. And then we're going to redevelop the airfield. And right here where the circle 2 is, we're going to build another satellite concourse that's parallel to that in the middle of the airfield. Number 3, we just opened a 5-gate expansion over on Concourse L. We're going to add another 3 gates and make some pavement improvements. When we do improve the airfield, we've got to make sure that that concrete can sustain the weight of the aircraft. Improvement number 4, there is going to be a tunnel that goes from the terminal core under the airfield is likely the answer. And so what it'll be is a consolidated tunnel. The APM, that stands for Automated People Mover. So that tunnel would take passengers, baggage. There would be a pedestrian component in case you wanted to walk to the first or the second satellite concourse, and of course all the utilities. The goal is to have that tunnel consolidate all of those functions. If we're going to dig under the airfield, we want to make sure that that tunnel can accommodate all of those needs. Item number 5, over here at Terminal 5, we do plan to do some curbside roadway and parking improvements over at Terminal 5. Circle 6, we do intend to start making improvements on the western edge of the airport. And this is called a western parking facility in the next 10 years. And then probably one of the biggest elements of this terminal area plan is Circle 7 here. We do intend to essentially replace Terminal 2 with a newer, larger global terminal that will be completely rebuilt. And then the final improvement are improvements to Terminal 5. So you can see a good number of the terminals, about half of them will see major improvements with some additional satellite concourses, parking on the west, and then roadway improvements over by Terminal 5. This is a quick, I believe this is the final slide. Yes, it is. At the top of the page, you see a graphic showing what was envisioned in the OMP, O'Hare Modernization Program. What you see in the top, the green terminals, new terminals were contemplated. We contemplated a Terminal 4, Terminal 6, and then on the western side, we did contemplate a western terminal with western concourses. The goal of this slide is to show the comparison down below. O'Hare 21 is the name of the larger program. Terminal Area Plan is just one component of O'Hare 21. So with the combination of the blue improvements and the orange improvements, you're seeing essentially what was just shown on the prior slide. To compare that OMP had terminals, so does O'Hare 21 on both sides of the airport. On the right-hand side of the page, we're comparing some of the numbers. The O'Hare Modernization Program had a very conservative estimate as the total number of flights. Recently, as I mentioned, the number of flights over the past few years has essentially held steady. So the forecasts have been adjusted. So with the terminal area plan, you're seeing a lower forecasted number of flights in a future year. We're looking at the total number of gates. We had originally conceived of 232 gates. That's been scaled back a bit. And so the terminal area plan contemplates about 220 total gates when we're all done. And then we talk about linear frontage. That's literally the measurement of linear feet of gate and concourse space available. And again, these are based on the older forecasts for OMP and then newer forecasts for the terminal area plan. So we wanted to share that with you because Don and Glenn in our preparation for tonight's presentation knew that there might be some interest in further improvements at O'Hare, and we thought this might be a good opportunity to share those with you. And Don, with that, that completes the presentation.